everybody! Today's video is going to be the first of a series of videos that I'm going to be doing about the evolution of Portuguese as a language. I'm going to be talking about how Portuguese came to be and why Brazilian and European Portuguese are so different from one another. So in this first video of this series, we're going to be taking a look at how Portuguese came to be and what exactly language evolution is. Portuguese, as you probably already know by now, is a Romance language. That means that it is descended from Latin. The Latin language was the language used across the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire spanned a wide swathe of territory going from Portugal in the west to the Middle East in the East. Latin was the language spoken in Rome, and as the Romans went on to conquer not just the Italian peninsula, but all of the territory that they ended up in, they took their language with them. As a result, despite there being many languages and many cultures under the umbrella of the Roman Empire, the Latin language flourished as the language of schools and administration. As a result, Latin came to be the language of the upper classes, which then would find its way down into the common classes of people. Humans are very predictable, and so even back then, what the aristocracy did or found fashionable would find its way to the commoners, who would then try to emulate it. That could be any fashionable thing, but it does include language much the same way as it works today. By the time the Romans managed to conquer the western extremities of the Iberian Peninsula, there were other peoples living there, but they were rapidly absorbed. This is also a couple of centuries into the Common Era. So at that point, Latin itself had already had hundreds and hundreds of years to evolve. That led to there being a Classical Latin and a Vulgar Latin. Classical Latin was the language used in administration and the formal language used in written documents. Classical Latin, therefore, is the Latin that got preserved in the form of all of the texts and other inscriptions and things that we have to this day. However, Vulgar Latin was the Latin actually spoken. It was the Latin spoken by Roman soldiers who would go to inhabit the new places that Rome was conquering. And it was a Latin that was profoundly different from the Latin used in the administration. There are parallels to this situation in the modern world, of course, especially when we think about languages like Arabic. You might already know this, but Arabic is not best described as just one language. Arabic has a standardized form that, much like Classical Latin, is used in administrative documents, in official affairs, even on the news, and in cultural exports between Arabic countries. But the Arabic spoken in the different corners of the Arabic-speaking world is dramatically different from the standard. It deviates so much from one region to another that some people, when they're speaking their variety of Arabic, have a hard time understanding each other if they are from regions that are far enough apart. This is the closest parallel that we have in modern times to the situation of Latin back then. It should go without saying that Vulgar Latin would go on to become the embryonic forms of the Romance languages as we know them today. I'm talking indeed about Spanish and Portuguese and French and other Romance languages. But Latin mostly stayed together and mostly stayed cohesive over a long period of time. This is because of the centrifugal effect that Rome had on the empire in harmonizing the educational and administrative systems. Because it was Rome managing the affairs of its province and therefore generating a constant flux of people across the Roman Empire, including Romans who would speak Latin in any of the provinces that they ended up going to, there was always some flux of Latin in every corner of the Roman Empire. This would naturally all begin to break down when the Roman Empire collapsed. When we look at the Romance family of languages and we look at the full language family, we can see that the languages themselves are more of a spectrum than they are clean branches separate from one another. That is to say that modern Portuguese is a lot like modern Galician, which is a lot like modern Asturian, which is a lot like modern Spanish, and so on. You can basically trace a spectrum stemming from Portugal in the west to the extremities of Italy in the east. Romanian is also a Romance language, but it is very different from the rest of them because Romanian stems from the Vulgar Latin spoken in the Eastern Roman Empire. As a result, Romanian and other East Romance varieties developed markedly differently from their Romance language sisters. After the Roman Empire collapsed, Germanic tribes came in and conquered much of the territory that Rome had occupied previously. This led to the formalization of the isolated population of the peoples living in different regions. What that meant is that the flux of Latin speakers coming from Rome would slowly come to an end. That meant that the vulgar Latin that was spoken in all of these different regions became self-containing. People became influenced by the ways that people spoke in regions around them instead of outsiders coming from Rome and other regions where Latin was also spoken. It only took a few hundred years for the first traces of Galician Portuguese to start popping up. Now that is all fine and well, but we need to talk a little bit about how language evolution actually works. Languages evolve based on the adaptation of them to the necessities of their speakers. What that means is that people communicate amongst themselves and look for new words and ways of expressing themselves in order to be understood. We can see parallels of this even in things like memes. If you think about the memes that were popular and funny 5 years ago, they're not that popular and they're not that funny nowadays because we already all know what they are and we've already heard them a million times, and they no longer line up with the things that we're thinking about and the ways that we're thinking about them nowadays. Memes are a means of social communication. They express a commonly shared thought or feeling or what have you, and they're a way for a lot of people to instantly relate to one another. And that is basically how language itself works. Language is just the all-encompassing umbrella for how we communicate amongst ourselves. So whether it's memes or the slang words that you use nowadays that you would have never thought of 5 years ago and that certainly your grandma doesn't understand, we are making our language evolve all the time. We're always giving a new shade of meaning to a word or using our grammar just a little bit differently in a way that bit by bit changes the shape of the language as we know it. This is most marked between generations, which means that almost no generation speaks the way that their parents did before them. When you add that up over generations and generations and generations, you get profound differences in language. We think of the way that people in the 1800s sounds quaint and rustic because it is so different, but at the time that was the contemporary way of speaking. They in turn would have found the speech patterns of people from the 16 and 1700s to be equally quaint. It's a constant process of tinkering and changing as we communicate. We are literally changing the language constantly as we speak. So as a result, we can't think of our languages as being hard boundaries. There's no hard boundaries between the way that we talk nowadays and the way that we talked 200 years ago. There's also no specifically hard boundary for the ways that our languages diverge from one another. That's right, I'm talking about the way that Portuguese itself has split up into different varieties. We see this in all different forms of modern languages, even in English. The simple fact of the matter is, as languages are used by people and spoken in an area, if those people are geographically or politically separated from one another, they will keep talking amongst themselves, and that process of tinkering little bit by little bit will continue along in its own separate way. Portuguese has had about 500 years of this, which has led to the dramatic divergence between European and Brazilian Portuguese. This also explains why African varieties of Portuguese are not as divergent from the European Portuguese norm as Brazilian Portuguese is. Given enough time and lack of political or social integration between the countries, African varieties of Portuguese will also diverge from European Portuguese, much the way that Brazilian Portuguese did. But that doesn't exclude Portugal itself from having its own evolution. In these 500 years, European Portuguese has evolved just as much as Brazilian Portuguese has. And so in my next videos, I'm going to be talking about some of the ways in which European and Brazilian Portuguese have evolved to become the distinct varieties that they are today. And so on that note, that's all I've got for this first video in this series about the evolution of Portuguese as a language. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food, culture, and indeed the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.